You're listening to Thunderquack Podcast Network.
Hello there, and welcome to the very first episode, the premiere episode of Thunderquack Force Perspectives. You might be asking yourself, what the hell is this? I was subscribed to Faster, More Intense. And yeah, you were. You might also be subscribed to Frontlines, the Clone Wars podcast, or Rebel Cells, the Star Wars animation podcast, and you're getting this episode because I'm going to put it on all those feeds. But this is actually, guess what? Faster, More Intense. It's kind of like that podcast name is going away. It's now this podcast. We're gonna kind of pivot, but you guys are already all here, so I'm like, hey, if you don't want to listen to this, you can unsubscribe. That's cool. But I hope that you'll stick around for this new show. I am your host, Michael Cohen. You may recognize my voice from all of those other podcasts that I talked about. Theoretically, if you're subscribed, you know who I am, because you've been listening to the podcast for at least a while. I said that I was retiring from Star Wars podcasting. That's what I said that I was doing, and I'm back, which Joe, rightfully predicted that it wouldn't take long. But here's the caveat: we're not doing what we used to do. This isn't the old thing. This is a completely new format for me for Star Wars podcasts. It might be familiar to some other stuff that's out there, but essentially what we're doing is taking a step back from the news and the sort of the day-to-day Star Wars conversations, and focusing in a little bit more on individual experiences and the relationship with Star Wars that we have as fans. So that's what Force Perspectives is going to be. How I'm going to get there is a little bit of a mystery to me right now. I'm making this up as I go, but that's the plan. Is to talk a little bit more about why we love Star Wars and the relationship that we have to it. Then the same thing everybody else is out there talking about and doing a much better job. Look, listen, there are better recap shows. Even though, hey, maybe I was one of the first back in 2008. That's fine. But there are better recap shows now. There are definitely better shows that are going to do like meta analysis and deep dives. You guys know What the Force. Go listen. Marie Claire has my full support. Go check out the back catalog. Just listen to all of that, the whole show. It's all fantastic. Sky Talkers is out there. Like there are so many other great Star Wars podcasts doing those things that I wanted to do something different. And that's what brought me back into this idea, especially after Star Wars Celebration and meeting new people and having conversations with them about why they love Star Wars, and sort of really hitting on that whole idea of like, we all love this one thing. This is actually kind of also like the negative side of it, right? Is that we all love this one thing, but we all love it for very different reasons, have very different relationships with it. And that's where, I think sometimes some of the conflict comes from. But my hope is that with a podcast like this, we can focus back in on a little bit more about, like, we may come at it from different perspectives and with different ideologies, but Star Wars should and can be the common ground to bring us together as a fandom. I don't think that I'm going to solve all of fandom's problems. Twitter is far too toxic a place to be combated with a simple podcast. But but I'm going to do my piece to make sure that my corner of the internet is nice and happy. And that's why I decided to come back. That's why I decided to do this show. And we're just going to take over the faster, more intense feed because we're not going to do that one anymore. Rebel Cells might come back when Bad Batch comes back. I don't know if I'll be on it on a regular basis, but I might be on it from time to time. Which obviously Rebel Cells took over from Frontlines and Rebels podcast, right? So that still maintains the animated stuff, which we've covered every episode of animated television in Star Wars so far. I don't know why we would stop, but yeah, we'll see in September what happens. But for now, this is Force Perspectives. I got to give a quick shout out to our Patreon producer, Brian Murowski, who is a Patreon producer from Thunderquack, but is now a Patreon producer of this because that's how that works. If you don't know what Patreon is, it's a platform that you can go to and support the show with a monthly pledge, and then you get some bonuses and stuff. We didn't really talk about it on the past shows because that was more of a Thunderquack thing and not so much for the Star Wars shows, but now it's kind of both. So if you want to get this early, Force Perspectives right now will be once a month, once every 4 weeks technically. And if you want to get it on Tuesday as opposed to getting it on the Friday, you can head over to patreon.com/thunderquack. And if you kick in at the $1 level, you'll get the early episode. There are other bonuses as well. I do a bi-weekly podcast called Off the Record that is for Patreon only, where I just talk about whatever geeky stuff kind of strikes my fancy. I just did an episode about Prey, which is a phenomenal movie. If you haven't watched it yet, it's awesome. Go watch it. Yeah, so like I just kind of talk about whatever. Just general geeky stuff. That'll be where I probably talk mostly about Marvel and DC and sort of that other general geeky stuff. And that's at the $5 level. And then we have other bonuses as well. You'll also get early access to Perfect 10, which is my other new podcast, where I talk to my friends about the things that they think are masterpieces, perfect tens, like movies, TV shows. The first episode I talked with Joe Hogan about Ghostbusters. The next episode I'm talking with my friend Tyler Nickel about Transformers the movie, the soundtrack. So that one's going to run the full gamut of all sorts of stuff. And you'll get that as well as a Patreon bonus if you decide to kick in over there. So all of that rigmarole out of the way, without further ado, let me introduce my guest for this episode, the first episode of Force Perspectives. Danielle, thank you for being here. You were on Faster, More Intense a few times.
Hi, thank you.
You just had to sit through all that rigmarole.
Nope, that's fine.
But you're the first guest on the new show, which is really exciting.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, for those who don't know, Danielle and I met on Twitter, we met when I said a dumb thing, a very ill-informed, dumb, I would say like borderline misogynistic, if not full-on misogynistic, lowercase m misogynistic, unintentionally, like not really knowing what I was doing. Sort of response to a post from a Raylo, and I brought down the full ire of the Raylo community on myself that day, and this was early on in the pandemic, really like right at the beginning of it, kind of maybe even before the actual pandemic. It might have been in February.
I'd say it was either a little before Tross or a little after.
It was right after Tross. I know that for sure. Yeah. And in the midst of everybody dogpiling on me, again, rightfully so. I mean, like I really, put my foot in my mouth with what I had said. But in the midst of that, there was the first person to sort of, as I went like, hey guys, I did not mean to upset anybody. Please help me understand. Danielle was the first one to reach out a hand and pull me out of the dog pile. And I credit you with with converting me, taking me from someone who was like, because
Aw.
essentially what I said was that Kylo Ren was a bad example to set for like a Rey wanting to fix Kylo Ren
Uh-huh.
was a bad example for young women, and then I was told that it really wasn't my place to tell young women what they should or shouldn't fantasize about, and everybody was right. I was wrong. um but I had a lot of learning to do, and you started me on that path, and started me on the path to becoming a full on Raylo in the way that you,
It's been fun to watch from afar.
yeah, you really you put it into a perspective that I had never considered before, which was more of like a
Mm.
mental health perspective
Yeah.
for Ben Solo. And it was really like, because I was one of those ones that was like, he's a war criminal, he's committed genocide, he's like Darth Vader, and then it's like, yeah, but wasn't Darth Vader worth saving too? And it's like, oh yeah, that's
Yep.
right.
Yep.
And it, yeah, like just totally flipped my perspective, put me on the path to discovering what the Force and other podcasts and that whole community.
Mhm.
And yeah, you radicalized me. I became a radical Raylo because of you.
I just
And we
enlightened.
talked,
I enlightened you. I didn't
yeah,
radicalize you.
yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a whole episode. So if you go back in this feed, you'll be able to find the older episode. I'm not getting rid of them. The older episodes of Faster, More Intense. And we have a whole episode where you and I go into the detail of
Mhm.
all of that.
Yeah, it was fun.
That people can go back and listen to. But this one's not about me. That's the whole thing with this new podcast, is that as much as I love to talk about Star Wars, what I want to do is I want to talk to other people about their experience with Star Wars,
Sure.
in the hopes that, I'll learn something and the audience will learn something, in the same way that I did that day when I really stepped in it, and it totally changed my point of view
Mm.
on not just Ben Solo, not just Kylo Ren, but really like eventually all of Star Wars. Like, it reframed everything for me.
Right.
Um, and Obi-Wan being my favorite character, and his most notable quote, other than "May the Force be with you," being "Many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view." That's
Yeah.
kind of
That's
that's where the
a
Force
solid truth.
perspectives part comes from, right? So
Yeah.
so without further ado, the way that we get into this, the way that we access this conversation, is by me asking you what your favorite piece of Star Wars is, right?
Right.
And I
um.
and I gave you that question, and then
Yeah.
you went and you tried to answer it.
Yeah, so I when you had pitched this idea to me, I instantly loved it, and you're like, "Oh, just tell me what your favorite Star Wars is and, why you love it and how it's affected you." And I'm like, "Okay, this should be easy." And I
Yeah,
spent days and days thinking about it, and I came away with all of it, is my answer. And
yeah,
and it was so funny because I kept thinking, well, I saw the originals, and then this is how it affected me as a kid, and then then the prequels came out when I was a teen, and that's how
hmm,
they affected me. And but now that I'm an adult and the sequels are out, well, they've definitely affected me this way. And I had just finished watching. If listeners, if you haven't, please go watch Light and Magic on Disney Plus. It's
yes,
about Lucas starting Industrial Light and Magic, and how they've became so amazing. And it really opened me up to seeing one man's film changed a lot of the way I saw life. It was the way it did, it changed the way I used my imagination. It informed decisions. It illuminated so much about me as a person. And the idea I'm going to come to you all with is, because I'm a loser, I ended up going through childhood photos and looking up dates and saying, well, this is the first Star Wars memory that I have. And I'm going to share this with you real quick, and then hopefully Michael and I can pull this apart for your enjoyment. Um, so, real quick, I was born in 1987. For some of you, that may sound like forever ago. For others, not too long ago. But in 1990, at the age of 2.5, Star Tours, which had only been open for a couple of months, was actually my first introduction to Star Wars. My parents had obviously seen it and they were big fans. And so here's this ride, and this was my first trip to Disney World, and they were like, yeah, let's go on this. And I remember walking in, here's this giant vehicle with these, metal animatronic things moving around, and they usher me into this vehicle, and I'm strapping my little tiny self into this seat, and there's a giant screen, and this crazy sounding robot that is suspiciously sounding like Pee-wee Herman, and I'm getting tossed through asteroids and giant balls of ice, and then there's a giant ship, and I'm being shot at, and I'm being tossed around, and I'm like, I don't know what this is, but it's a blast. And my dad tried to explain it to me, but I don't really have a full context. I just know whatever that Star Wars thing was, it was fun. And so fast forward a bit to 1991, and I'm playing in the floor with some toys, and my dad, looking at the TV guide, that's how old I am, he tosses it off to the side, and he jumps out of the chair, and he starts pulling out VHS tapes and wiring it up to the TV. What in the world are you doing? And he goes, you need to see the greatest piece of cinema that has ever been made. And I'm like, yeah, okay, Dad, sure. And it was Return of the Jedi. And it was running as like a holiday special where they were all being shown. And starting with that one, and then eventually going back and watching what became A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, those I was 4 years old, and that was my introduction. And Empire instantly became my favorite. I love the Tauntauns, the fact that there were all these really amazing characters that were going through a really cool drama that I personally had never seen, I'd never thought of. The creatures, the effects, all of it. I was captivated by its scope and locations and actions and gadgets and creatures. It blew me away. And I was actually, and still kind of am today, even as an adult, I'm terrified of aliens. But Star Wars was the one safe place of sci-fi where I could see races of aliens that didn't instantly send me into a panic attack. And so it kind of made it like this little safe place in a way. And while, a lot of other people out there may say they connected with Leia or Luke or Han, I didn't really connect with any of them. But I connected with the fact that I am a small child who sees an adventure, who sees friends going on an adventure, and I want a slice of that. But when I started talking to my dad about it, he was like, oh, well, this guy named George Lucas made it. And I'm like, well, what's he do? Well, he's a filmmaker. And that's what I hooked on to. I want to be like George Lucas. I have all these amazing ideas in my head. I want to be like George, and I want to share them with the world. And it was also around this time that my dad was like, well, if you like that, wait till you see this. And I got introduced to Willow. I got introduced to E.T., Jaws, Indiana Jones. And by the time the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles aired in 1992, I was hooked. I was converted. I wanted to be the next George and the next Spielberg. And in 1993, I was 5.5, and we went back to Disney World, and I got to experience Star Tours again. Only this time, I now knew what flying through the Death Star like Luke felt like. So when I would go home and watch it again, I knew what that was like for him. And I was collecting toys. I was buying plastic little lightsabers and acting it out. And I would excitedly go to school and tell my classmates or my cousins about this amazing movie that I had seen. And they're like, what's Star Wars? That makes no sense. That sounds dumb. It sounds boring. So the only way I could share it was with my parents, essentially. But through it, I was like, okay, well, how do you make a movie? How did they make the Tauntauns move? How did the Ewoks work? And so he told me a little bit about industrial light and magic. And I instantly knew that was such a creative place, that was something I wanted to do. I wanted a job where I could express creativity day to day and be proud of what I did. And this was around the same time that Jurassic Park was also coming out, and seeing, that next level that ILM was going to just solidified it for me. And through John Williams and through Star Wars, I learned that music, especially score music, is extremely special in that it has the very subtle ability to manipulate not only a film, but you as an audience member. And I mean, even to this day, like, I honestly prefer listening to film scores than I do regular music. But around 1994, Panasonic camcorders were becoming more of a common thing. My dad picked one up. And so this is when I really started trying to pursue that. I want to be George Lucas making a movie. And I would film myself. I would, pull school friends over and film them. And I would take, action figure toys and film them talking and moving. They were my claymation and my CGI. And that was a favorite activity of mine for years and years and years that would eventually make a mark on my college years and the years ahead. Fast forward a bit more to 1997, I've seen them a dozen times. I know what Star Wars is about. It's not a big deal. So when the special editions get released in theaters, my parents are like, you've got to experience it on the big screen. And I'm like, I don't know, that seems dumb. It's nothing different. But I ended up enjoying it anyways, especially for the fact that while most people nowadays would pick those added in CGI scenes apart, back then, and for someone who really liked what ILM was doing, it was a blast to see. Like, okay, if this is what they're doing and adding in, I can't wait to see what this rumored new Star Wars is going to look like. And in 1999, my excitement with the rest of the world as well was in full swing with The Phantom Menace. And Queen Amidala and Obi-Wan were absolute instant favorites that still are favorites of mine to this day. And I was 11 years old at that time, and it was my brother, I think, might have been 3. And it was really the one thing that he and I actually connected with was talking about Star Wars, listening to Star Wars, playing Star Wars. I painted him up to look like Darth Maul. I dressed him up like Anakin and would film him with like rolled up blankets, pretending it to be like a pod race, and I'm shaking the camera around. But they were selling Padawan braids. I was wearing Padawan braids. I was painting my face up to be like the Queen of Naboo. It was just an absolute fun time. And then in 2002, I was about 14 and a half. Attack of the Clones came out, and instantly it became my favorite. I was at an age where I understood the awkwardness and the desire that was being presented between Anakin and Padme. And, at 11, having a crush on Obi-Wan, and then seeing him become more of this adult mentor figure to Anakin. At 14 and a half, I took comfort in knowing that, okay, Obi-Wan is clearly still trying to get his ducks in a row, but he's not all there. He's not a perfect adult, but he keeps trying. So I found that in a weird way reassuring. Another big thing, too, is that when Attack of the Clones released, it was several months after 9/11 happened here in America. And so even though The Phantom Menace had a lot of politics, now that I'm seeing, throngs of clones being bred just for war, going to war, over what may or may not be a legitimate thing, the Iraq War was happening at that time. And so suddenly, I'm in the 9th grade and I'm seeing this, and it now becomes more of a prominent thing to pay attention to than it had just a few years prior. And so it was kind of a way for me to digest in a safe, comforting way what was going on around me. And jumping up to 2005, at the age of 17, Revenge of the Sith came out a month before I graduated high school. And that one in particular, even though it wasn't my favorite, was very personal to me, simply because I was getting ready to go into college to study political science. So that was another way I kind of related to Padme. Um, at that point in time, I was also dating a guy who was a little younger than me, and it was very quickly becoming awkward. And he was also fantasizing about going into the military, joining the fight, and it was kind of making him a sort of an abusive person. And so watching Revenge of the Sith in this weird way was kind of like a foreshadowing. And once things ended soon after, between the guy I was dating at the time, it also felt like a relief of like, okay, that could have been me at a certain point, and that could have been him at a certain point. And so it was a relief almost, that watching this film was like, well, thank goodness I didn't end up that way. Fast forward again to 2016. I'm now dating the guy who ended up marrying, is my husband now. But I had an opportunity to take a film class, and I wasn't going to do it, but I had told him about, Star Wars's impact on me as a kid, and making all these home films and stuff. And he said, well, just go for it. How often in life do you have the chance to make a film? And I thought, you know what? Yeah, I'll go for it. And so I did. I took the class. I learned the workings of physical film, of lighting, of cinematography, and yes, old school editing by hand. If you ever hear George Lucas talk about how much of a pain editing was, I can tell you by literally stamping like a razor blade against little slices of film and taping them together with clear tape. It is a huge pain. But in the end, I ended up sharing with my classmates and another film class a 5-minute silent black and white story filmed on 8mm Kodak film about a broken young man reflecting back on happy memories of his girlfriend, whom at the last scene you learn has died in a car crash. And when it was over, I remember the room being completely stunned and silent. And the teacher and I hadn't really seen eye to eye the whole class, but she came up to me and she was like, I have never seen a student film that moved me that way. And, I took a lot of pride in that, because when I was filming it, I kept thinking back to all, the little behind the scenes of George making Star Wars, and then of him and the, trying to get the prequels off the ground. And so while it wasn't Star Wars, at 18, I had achieved what I had always been inspired by him and by Star Wars to do all those years ago. And that was to tell a story on film. And so after that, for the next 9 years or so, adult life happens, and Star Wars went into a lull, but it always made me think of fond, happy memories. And I will always appreciate it for that. And then TFA happened in 2015, and I was 28, and I was so excited when I saw the trailer that I got goosebumps and I almost cried. And what was really nice too was, while my husband had seen Star Wars, and he wasn't really necessarily a big fan, but for the first time he was genuinely excited about seeing it with me. And we also had 2 young children by then, and there was a third one on the way. And it was really exciting to me, because even though they had seen Star Wars, they didn't really care much about it. But I knew the sequel trilogy, is going to be their Star Wars. Like the prequels were mine and the originals were my parents'. And it felt cool to be taking over my dad's role of introducing the next generation to this amazing story and these amazing films. And so I think here in America, it came out December 19th, and I saw it on the 21st. And then the very next morning, I gave birth to our daughter. So that was a pretty cool roller coaster experience. But in watching it, Rey was everything I had wanted at 5 years old. And she was spunky, she was stubborn, she was capable, but she was also scared and unsure. And that moment when the lightsaber flew into her hand and the Force theme that I had grown up being moved by swelled, my eyes literally watered. It was so fantastic. And it was really cool too, because while Rey absolutely spoke to the child in me, I was completely taken off guard by Kylo being relatable to me as an adult. He was conflicted about his actions that he took. Seemed unhappy with his place in the world. He felt increasingly unstable, and those were things that I not only saw myself in, but very closely related to. And that felt in its own really special. And then in 2017, in that space between TFA and TLJ, there was a lot going on, not only just in my life, but in my own personal journey. I had gotten diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It was a bit of an uphill battle to find medication that helped me finally get to somewhere that made me feel normal. And I finally achieved that, what I would say, balance for what is me, um, just a few days before I saw The Last Jedi. And so I was at a good place to really digest, this new film. I could experience it as a quote unquote normal person. And at first, I ended up not liking The Last Jedi, but I couldn't understand why. And that's
Mhm.
because it's a different film. I wasn't really sure how to feel about Luke's story. That I was frustrated because he wasn't what I remember, but at the same time, I related to him. But I was frustrated with what was going on with Finn and Poe. But it was through Rey and Kylo that kept me engaged in that story, and I just could not get enough. And so, over the next 4 months into 2018, I kept thinking about the film. Like, there's something to it that it's trying to say to me. I just don't know what that is. And so when the extended novel came out, I was like, okay, I'm going to give this another try and let me see how I feel about it. And I read it and was like, okay, this is a great film. I rewatched it. I saw all the missing pieces. I started seeking out community for the first time, like I never had before. It's how I ran into Mary Claire Gould and with What the Force podcast. In Twitter, it was the only reason I engaged in Twitter. It was through trying to understand what this piece of Star Wars was telling me and wanting more of whatever Reylo was. I don't mind romance per se, but I had never actively sought it out before in storytelling. And for the first time ever, I was looking into what was myth. What did mythic stories say or were trying to say? What were tropes? How did tropes function in storytelling? And so it opened up a ton of knowledge that I had not really been aware of or knew anything about. And through all that, I found fan fiction for the first time as an adult and instantly fell in love. And so suddenly I had another gateway into my creativity where I didn't have a camera or action figures or actors anymore, but I had a website archive of our own, and I clearly had a hungry audience out there somewhere. And so my mind became the storyboards and the scripts, and my keyboard became my camera, and my words were now Industrial Light and Magic. And through all that, I eventually, 4 months later, was able to tell my own personal Star Wars story through words. And that felt absolutely amazing, beyond amazing. And in a way, it helped me find a joy in writing that I had never had before. And so then at the tail end of 2019, late 2018, I found out I was pregnant with her fourth and final child. And they were to be due on May 4th, Star Wars Day 2019, the same year The Rise of Skywalker is due to come out. And so I insisted, okay, this child has to have a Star Wars name. We have a Lord of the Rings baby, we have a Batman baby, we have a Halo baby, we gotta have a Star Wars baby. And so my husband's favorite film is Revenge of the Sith, and his favorite characters are Anakin and Vader. And I said, well, Kylo and Ben Solo are mine. So let's name him Anakin Ben. And so on May 1st, Anakin Ben Kelly was born. And that was an absolute thrilling thing. At the tail end of it that year, I ended up not seeing The Rise of Skywalker simply because when I read what all took place in the film, it was soul crushing, to be honest. But I will always remember the excitement I had leading up to it. Like, it was infectious. And both in the community and at that year for celebration, that part of it was awesome. And then COVID happened, and we all kind of hung out in our house for a while. But at the tail end of 2020, I was finally able to visit Galaxy's Edge in Florida. And while the experience was bittersweet due to the hurt of, knowing what happened to these characters I loved, it was absolutely amazing to stand in a place that I had only dreamed of while standing in line for Star Tours 30 years earlier. I was finally wielding my very own personalized lightsaber. I was eating at the Docking Bay restaurant that I had written about in one of my fanfic stories just months earlier. And what was really cool is at the age of 5, my daughter Cortana got to experience Star Tours alongside me. And she was so thrilled seeing all, these characters from this movie that she had seen, the way I had felt. And she had an absolute blast being the pilot on the Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run. And I think that's what it is. It was something that I was shown as a child and then got to experience. And then she was shown as a small child and then got to experience at that young age. And it's really given me so much. Star Wars as a whole given me so much just through all these events up to that point. I mean, I got to do a Star Wars podcast with you, Michael. That's something I never could have seen ever happening. And this is my third one, no less. And then now that we have Disney Plus shows, it's super easy to share that with them even more, and with my parents. I have pictures of my husband and my kids and I with my parents sitting around watching Mandalorian on a couch together as part of our vacation. And so it's just given me so much stuff. I mean, the walls of my office, I have paintings that I felt inspired to paint of Naboo and Endor hanging on my walls. I've met absolutely amazing artists from around the globe who I commissioned Raylo artwork from that hang very proudly almost on every inch of my wall space. But I mean, none of that would have been capable without Star Wars, without what was it about, or what George Lucas was trying to say. And all that happened just because at the age of 2, my parents decided to be like, hey, come ride this ride with me. So yeah, that is my Star Wars story.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, like that really takes us through all of it, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole timeline. It's so great because there are so many places where that sort of like intersects with my own story, and my own relationship to Star Wars,
Mm.
and but there's also so many things that are so different. I mean, like, I love that Star Tours is your introduction to it. It's so funny because, like, for me, I my very first memory of knowing that what I was watching was Star Wars was, like, we had gone to my uncle's house. He had just gotten the trilogy on VHS, and I I must have been like, I haven't done the sort of like figured out the time but I think I was about 4. And my oldest brother, was 5 years older than me, wanted to watch Empire Strikes Back, so that's what got put on, and we sat through
Excellent
it
choice.
until it got to the point of the space slug.
Mm.
And when that thing pops out of that asteroid, I lost it. Like, I lost it. I was like, nope. And it's so funny because like it's such a vivid memory, and I think about it, and it's like, my uncle was showing off his brand new TV, his brand new VHS player, and these Star Wars VHS tapes. So I'm
Right.
very proud of it. And like, oh, this new big TV, and I'll bet you it wasn't 30 inches, right? Like, I'll bet
Yeah.
you like the screen
Hey,
was
that was
so
big
small.
back then. That was
Yeah,
big.
no, for sure, right? Like back, yeah, because this would have been in like the late 80s, early 90s.
Uh-huh.
um and I but like 4:3, not even in widescreen, right?
Mhm.
But like that's like that to me, it's so funny because like I didn't watch Star Wars then for like almost another like 5 or 6 years before I started to get into it, because I was like 10 when I got into it. And like I swore off it. I was like, nope, like, I'm not doing it. And I was a Star Trek kid for a long time, because
Yeah.
me and my dad used to sit and watch Next Gen together. We used to sit on the bed, and nobody else wanted to watch Star Trek, so it was
Yep.
just me and
My
him.
my parents watched Next Gen too, but, I was creeped out by the Klingons, so
Yeah, and
yeah,
like
and
I just
Borg were off limits.
that that
Nope.
that became my sci-fi thing until I got older,
Yeah.
and eventually found Star Wars again. And the way that I did was through the music. So like
Mm.
we had a cassette tape. We were on a road trip, and I'd listened to everything else. I'd listened to the Lion King soundtrack 3 times,
Yep.
and this was
Same.
firmly places where it is, right? 1994.
Yep.
I and was like look like rifling through these things, and put the Star Wars soundtrack in and started listening to it, and was just like, I need to know more about this, just off of the music, just off of John Williams. Like, I
Yeah,
had
it's
such
that
little
good.
familiarity. Yeah, like I knew Darth Vader, I knew lightsabers, I knew stormtroopers. I didn't really know any of the other characters' names, right? Like, the
Mhm.
only other familiarity I had with the story was the Muppet Babies episode, right?
Cute.
Which is such a backwards way of viewing Star Wars for the first time. Um but yeah, it's why to this day, like, when people tell me what their first thing was, especially younger people, especially like actual children nowadays,
Mm.
and they tell me, I oh, well, the first Star Wars that I interacted with was Angry Birds Star Wars, and other people get judgy about it, and I'm like, whatever, man, whatever got you to the table, I don't care,
Right,
right? Because
yeah,
we all came to it in our own ways, especially those of us who were born after Star Wars was already the thing, right?
yeah.
Um,
Well,
so yeah,
when I was talking to my husband about it, he said that he had heard school kids talking about Star Wars, and so he asked his mom, "Can you go to the video store and rent me Star Wars?" She had no clue. She picked up Spaceballs. And so for years he thought, "Okay, Star Wars is Spaceballs." And then
yeah,
like a brother-in-law got him a Darth Vader figure, and he's like, "What the heck? This isn't the same thing." And then it was right around the same time that the special editions released, and so his dad
hmm.
was like, "Okay, let's do something. Let's go watch Empire Strikes Back." And then that's when he was like, "Oh, this is Star Wars."
Oh,
So,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
so
It's
yeah.
so funny. It's so funny because Empire, I think, is the one that really like cements it, right? Like Star
Mhm.
Wars. And when I would talk to my parents, because my parents were there on day one. My
Yeah.
parents lived in Los Angeles
Oh, wow.
in the 70s, and in Hermosa Beach, which is not too far away from like downtown LA, basically. And they saw it at not at the Chinese theater, but at Century City, which is one of the at the time it was one of the bigger. I think actually Century City was a bigger screen, but
Mm.
like it didn't matter because like everywhere in Los Angeles that weekend that Star Wars opened, it was just
Uh-huh.
like lines around the block. It was like you had to wait like 2-3 hours in line to get into this movie.
Yeah.
And my mom, not a movie person, but she will talk about that day as like It was pretty amazing. Well, my dad was very much like me, like a huge geek,
Uh-huh.
huge into movies. And so when he would talk about it, it was like, oh yeah, man, it was like boom, like, and my dad had seen everything, right? Like all of everything sci-fi, 2001, Planet of the Apes, like all of the classic sci-fi of
Yeah.
that era leading up to that, but then was like, no, it was a totally different thing. Um, but then like Empire, I think, is the thing that like really like ratchets it up,
Yeah.
right?
I
And
think so
cements
because
it for a lot of people.
like I had said, the one I actually did watch first was Return of the Jedi, which I've heard
Hmm.
several other people say that too.
Yep.
Um, and I'm kind of like, what's this weird show with the dude with like the glowy sword and the teddy bears?
Yeah.
Like, it's
Yeah.
cool, but why is this random dude dying and the music's telling me it's sad? I don't understand.
Yeah.
And
There's no
then
connection to the
he's like,
story,
let's
right?
start from the beginning. And then you watch A New Hope, and it's like, okay, I guess this is pretty cool. And then you get to Empire, and it's like, okay, whatever this is awesome. And
There's
now,
a yeah.
and then you go to Return of the Jedi, and it's like, now it makes
Now
sense.
it makes sense. Yeah. Like I think Return of the Jedi is one of the easy ones to go to because you've got the whole sequence with Jabba at the beginning. Look at all these aliens. Look at this crazy action sequence, the running and jumping and flipping and the
Hmm.
explosions. Really, really cool. And then, we cool it for a second, but then like not it's about 15 minutes and then we're on speeder bikes and we're like, whoa, this is the
Yeah.
coolest thing I've ever seen.
Yes.
And like from that point on, the movie just goes, right?
Yep.
um and the Battle of Endor is just like the
Amazing.
cross cutting, all of that stuff. So I think if you've seen all of Star Wars at the time, you're like, well, Return of the Jedi is the best one, right? Because
Right.
it just took that action and just like it did the things that I think George wishes that he could have done on previous ones, right? And it did it
Hmm.
to the best of its ability until the prequels, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
um like I don't think anybody surpassed the third act of Return of the Jedi until George was like, "Hey, watch this," and did it again in Phantom Menace. For everything else about Phantom Menace, the third act of Phantom Menace is like,
Yeah.
whoa, right? Because it's everything. It's everything that Return of the Jedi is, but with massively high fidelity, right?
Yes. Yes.
Especially when you consider it's 1999.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Oh man, I tell you what, I remember watching it thinking it was so blown away, the special effects. And
Hmm.
I remember for the Oscars, the awards were up between like Phantom Menace and The Matrix. Obviously, The Matrix won, and for good reason. But
Yeah.
at the time, as a child who hadn't been allowed to see The Matrix, I was like, I don't understand. Phantom Menace was amazing. And then a few years later, it's like, ooh, that's looking a bit dated. And then I guess a few months ago, I watched it on Disney Plus, and they must have went back and definitely done some texture redos because Sebulba looked a whole lot better than he used to.
Yeah, the on the Blu-ray pass, they cleaned some stuff up. And
Yeah,
I wouldn't be surprised if they went in and they upscaled some of
yeah,
that modeling, because at that point, right, they've got everything, right? I mean, like it, and
yeah,
that Light and Magic documentary, um
amazing.
I mean, it doesn't spend nearly enough time on the prequels, in my opinion, but
Yeah,
it really only talks about the Phantom Menace. We don't really get into like,
yeah.
because
I know.
I would really love to hear what George has to say about the era of shooting
Mhm.
Revenge of the Sith, because because Revenge of the Sith, I feel like he was going for something that they weren't quite ready for yet, and now like because then we kind of skip over that and go straight to the volume in that
Yeah,
documentary, and you get there and George walks on set and he's like, this is what I was talking about 20 years ago, this is what I've been talking about for the last 40 years.
I
And
know.
Kathleen Kenny is like, I know, I know, I've heard you talk about it. But he's like, the way that he's like it's not even that he's not impressed, because he's just like, I'm just glad somebody finally did this, right?
Yes,
Because you can see that on Revenge, that's what he was trying to do, but all they could do is just surround them with blue screen,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, it's it almost like breaks your heart to see him do it, because he's like, of course, once I retire, you guys figure out how to do this, you know.
That very tired. Well, at least
Yeah.
it got made thing.
Yeah, he just like he never takes his hand out of his pocket, and he's just holding that Starbucks coffee cup, and it's like the thing is like glued into his hand.
Yeah.
And he's just very George about it. Oh man, but the biggest takeaway that I had from that documentary is when you're watching the really old archive footage of like 1975, 1976, even before that, like you see some of that stuff from when he was working with Coppola on
Mm,
the American Zoetrope stuff, and you're like,
yeah.
George was kind of a bit of a cutie back in the day, right? Like I never really like looked at it before. So obviously I've seen lots of stuff of the Star Wars era, but there's a couple of moments like filming American Graffiti and stuff, and he's got that
Yeah.
Letterman jacket on, and he just kind
Yeah.
of it's I said this on Twitter. It's like it's all in the eyes. Like he just had like this kind of
He has a
it's
sweet
kind of like
face,
yeah, he's got a yeah,
like the
like
sweet
but he's
baby
just got a
face.
like
Yeah.
this twinkle in his eye that you're like, what's going on inside your head, man? Like I want to know, like tell me everything. And obviously that's what Star Wars ends up being is him going like, here's my imagination.
Mhm.
Please come enjoy. And we all
Yeah.
went, yes, thank you. But yeah, anything that anybody says about any of that other stuff, like the prequels, whatever, any bad stuff anybody has to say, it's like go watch Light and Magic because you'll have a new appreciation for that man
Yeah.
and the way that he like literally changed the world, literally like one man. Because who's to say, special effects would have eventually gotten there anyways because you had talented people that would have ended up figuring a lot of this stuff out, but George had that vision, and George is the one who brought together that team
Mhm.
and had the vision to look at that whole group and go, well, yeah, let's just bring this guy on, and then that guy says, I want to bring my friend, and he goes, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Right, like
Yeah.
he was the smart guy in the room to figure that out.
I mean, it
And
was really
without
fascinating
that,
when watching the documentary too, because because like I said, he was talking about, I hated editing these films. You can do it digitally.
yeah,
It's got to be done. And he's throwing money behind this idea of doing digitally. And,
yeah,
just for the casual person, it just kind of washes over and away from you. Like you don't really think much about it. Oh, progress is progress. But having personally done it myself, I'm like, oh my God, thank you, George, for actually
hmm,
pursuing and putting money and time and effort behind doing it because it was an
yeah,
absolute pain. And he talks about how, like, because this is the way it's done, nobody wants to change it. And then you kind of hear that again with the special effects. Well, this is how it's through claymation. Why do we need to do it any differently? And it's
yeah,
pushed. And I don't know if you have ever read the Steve Jobs biography. Amazing book. But it talks a little bit about a blurb of him acquiring, Pixar. And then obviously in the documentary it talks about him, coming up with that Pixar system
hmm,
just so he could try and push forward his movie and just the medium in general. And
yeah,
then if you know the other pieces along the way, you get the bigger picture that's being told. And it's just amazing because we know what Pixar did for animated films just from the Disney side of things. And tracing that step back is to him going, well, I want to make it better. What's in my head? I want to put what's in my head on the screen.
yeah,
So, and even then that comes back down to would we have had something like Lord of the Rings, or would we have had something like Avatar,
hmm,
if he had not been so insistent and not
yeah,
had that creative, you know, I guess ability and drive and financially to do that? I
yeah.
don't know. I don't
Yeah,
know.
well, and I think back on especially that era, and like you bring up Avatar and Lord of the Rings, and sort of the especially like the way that the media always wants to frame it, and then we get caught up in it as fans. This whole framing of like this or that, or even back in the day with Star Trek versus Star Wars, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then I think about like the way that James Cameron talks about ILM in that
Mm.
documentary, and the way that Steven Spielberg talks about what was going on and the way that they talk about George specifically. And the idea that these movies are ever in competition, that these franchises are in competition with one another, is such a reductive way to look at it, because
Yeah.
those filmmakers would be the first ones to tell you, Peter Jackson as well, right?
Mm.
They like, without George, none of this happens. we don't like, maybe eventually, it's time is a stream, right? Time is a river, and eventually the water all ends up in the same place anyways. So,
Right.
like just because George doesn't come up with it doesn't mean that somebody won't eventually. As I always want to say, like, there are alternative paths to the same solution,
Right.
but we live in the timeline. We live in the world where George Lucas is the guy who made this happen. And so he is the one who deserves that credit every time.
Yeah.
And not to mention, like, that we're just talking about special effects. That's not even getting into the way that he changed the way that people look at storytelling in
Oh yeah.
a genre sense, right? Like
Right.
he broke down so many boundaries of what, before then it was like, hey, this is a Western, this is science fiction, this is fantasy, that, this is a samurai film, this is that and the other thing. And he went, why can't it just all be the same thing? Like,
Yeah.
why can't you just tell a good story? And if you got to borrow from 6 different places to do it, then you do it, because it's, at the end of the day, story is what matters.
Right.
The quote that I took away from that documentary, that is something that, like, it exemplifies his genius, and it, like, goes into the core of everything that he's accomplished. They're talking about, this was at the point that they're talking about digital versus practical
Mm.
in effects, and he goes, when you're writing a script, it doesn't matter if you write it in pencil or if you write it in pen, the story's still the same.
Right.
And I was just like, it was like a galaxy brain moment of, like, that's what it comes down to, is, like, story is the most important thing. And I think that ultimately the other stuff, the other visionary things that he did, they only exist in service to that end, right? It
Mhm.
doesn't matter if it's the pencil or the pen. All that matters is that the story is up on the screen.
Right.
Um, and I feel like so many people would be better off if they could just shut off that overly critical part of their brain when it comes to things like visual effects or cinematography or any of that. Like, those things are all important in filmmaking as well, but at the end of the day, like, did we get the story? Did what we saw on screen, did it service the story? And if it services the story, then I'll forgive a lot of stuff. I'll
Right.
forgive a shoe in the background of
Yeah.
Return to the Jedi. Not that you can tell, anyways. But
Right. Well, like
like,
for Jurassic Park, for example, when you say
mhm,
Jurassic Park, like, sure, the brand new one, gorgeous CGI
mhm,
compared to the original, but what sticks with you? The story of the
yeah,
first one.
yeah,
So,
yeah, exactly. And yeah, like, because the original Jurassic Park has, like, less than 15 minutes of dinosaur footage in it, right?
yeah.
But and the new one, I think, is, it clocks in at something like 40 minutes of that bloated, massive monstrosity of a movie. Um, and it's like, it's more footage, more dinosaur footage than any Jurassic film before it.
Yeah.
And it's like, so what? So what? Like, and there's cool stuff. Like, don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
Dominion is a very fun movie. It's garbage. It's an absolute trash fire. But
It's
it's,
the bag of chips. It's so
yeah,
bad
but
for you, but you still
exactly.
eat it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like, yeah, perfect. Like flaming hot Cheetos, right? And I'm lactose intolerant, so this is double for me. So, like, a bag of flaming hot Cheetos, there's nothing good in there, right? You're eating mostly air, surrounded by puffed up, like, wheat or whatever it is, corn, whatever, right? It's just
Yep.
it's just garbage filler that has no nutritional value, covered in orange chemicals,
Yep.
and some sort of mysterious thing that makes your mouth burn, which makes you think that it's spicy, right?
But it looks good.
But damn if it doesn't look good, and damn if they don't taste delicious, right? Even though there's nothing of value in them
Yep.
whatsoever. And that's exactly what Dominion was for
Yep.
sure. I didn't think we'd talk about Jurassic World Dominion on this podcast about Star Wars, but all of that back to like, this is what we'll close out on, because this is what I'm the most
Okay.
curious about, because you talk about
Hmm.
your whole Star Wars journey, and um like how integral it is, and you know, you named one of your children after a Star Wars character, which I'm in the same boat. Kara's middle name is Rey.
Yeah.
Her first, she's named after Supergirl first, and then Star Wars second. I
Amazing.
I But have you watched Tross yet?
No, I still
You
haven't.
you still haven't seen it.
I still haven't. Nope.
This is one of those things where I know that it could go one of two ways. You will never ever see that movie, or one day eventually you'll be in a place where you're good to watch it, and you'll watch it.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think it's for two reasons. I think one is because for the most part I know what happens. I know the gist
mhm.
of it. I know the big
Yeah,
pieces that are important. So, it's not like I have absolutely no clue. I know what happens. I'm just
yeah.
sparing myself visually and audibly. But I mean, even if they say, let's say they came out with an episode 10 and it was everything I ever wanted, at the end of the day, if I went and saw it and they said, okay, would you see Rise of Skywalker before walking into this one? I would probably still say no. So,
See, and that to me is what we were just talking about. And this is why the reason why I brought it up, that story is king, right? Or
hmm.
not non-gendered monarch. Uh,
Right.
uh, like the story is ultimately the most important piece.
Yeah.
And Tross, it absolutely, like, it falters so hard right at the end. Uh, so much of that movie is forgivable if Ben Solo survives,
Hmm.
because like that, it doesn't matter how good it looks, which like parts of it look very good. The third
Yeah.
act is terrible. The third act is just blue and fuzzy. It,
Yeah.
it drives me nuts. It drives me nuts. You have the most budget of any movie imaginable. You have the entirety of
Make it
ILM at your
blue.
disposal, and it's a fuzzy fight inside, like unfocused cloud. It's awful. But anyways, um but all of that is forgiven to me for me if that ending were just like, if that one note were different.
Yeah.
um because as much of a train wreck as that movie is, and I mean, like, I know that you've seen gifs, and you've probably seen little clips, and people have put together videos and stuff like that, so I'm sure that you've seen segments of this. But like those final moments for Ben Solo, like from the moment that he comes back and utters his final line, "Ow." um
Uh,
it's funny because despite the story that got us to that point and what happens after it, there's like a magic in those scenes with him and Daisy Ridley, between Adam and Daisy, that is like,
yeah.
it's just like, it's unquantifiable. um and it kills me, because there's the other George quote of, like, you know, if the you know, it's like a happy ending, like the couple gets together, and it's a happy ending at the end. Yeah, the box office is like $100,000 more, something like that, right? Like, I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
horribly butchering his quote, but he said essentially, like, you know, like, if you give the audience the happy ending, they come back to
Yeah.
see it. And
Absolutely. I have never seen. I don't think I've ever seen a Star Wars film more than once, except if I'm remembering correctly, I think Phantom Menace might have been the only one I ever actually saw twice. And so leading up to Rise of Skywalker, I was like, okay, this is going to be my chance to see it multiple times. And
yeah,
it was the one film I never actually went to go see. So,
that's crazy. That's crazy. In the theater, you mean? Obviously, you've seen Star Wars movies more than once, but
well, yes, in theater.
yeah,
Phantom Menace in
yeah,
theater was the only one
yeah,
I saw twice. The rest
yeah,
just, well,
yeah. That's a funny thing, because like I only saw Attack of the Clones once in the theater. I think I saw Phantom Menace 3 times, and I think I saw
mm,
Revenge maybe twice. There are other movies that I've seen, like Force Awakens I saw 7 times. Episode
Oh,
7 I saw 7
if
times.
if I hadn't been stuck at home with a brand new newborn,
Yeah.
absolutely, I would have bought
Yeah.
ticket after
I just
ticket, but
I just kept
I
every
love it.
excuse to go back and see that movie, but that was also like 2015. That was the year before Cara was born. So,
Gotcha.
yeah, man, what a risk we took! What a risk we took with that middle name, because and it wasn't my idea; it was my wife's idea.
Uh-huh.
Because I was like, Cara was the one for me. I was like, I like that name from Supergirl. And I it was like we'd been throwing around a bunch of names,
Yeah.
um and and she was the one who was like Cara Ray, and I was like, really,
Mm.
Ray, like really, like and it was like she was like, yeah, why not? And
Yeah.
at the time the going theory was that she was a Kenobi, and I was like, yes. And as far as I'm concerned, there's still room. There's still room for that. I mean, the Obi-Wan show, I guess this is possibly the first time I've had the opportunity to talk about it on a Star Wars podcast. When Obi-Wan is like, I think I had a brother,
I know. Oh,
I
man,
was
you
like,
should have
I
seen
was
my
like,
face light up. I was like,
be,
"What?
because that was
Lugo."
that was at about the same time that we got that excerpt from Star Wars. This book is mostly about Ochi.
Uh-huh.
I don't remember what it's called.
Oh,
Shadow of the Sith.
Shadow of the Sith. I'm
Yeah.
teetering on whether or not to read
Oh
it.
my god. I could not get into it. I could not get into it.
Okay,
'Cause
okay.
I was the audiobook for me, so if you like to read books, it'd probably have a better time. The audiobook, the
Mm.
voice that I think it's Mark Thompson is doing uh for Ochi is just awful. It's just like so grating. But
You know,
that
sometimes
chapter
I
that
can tell, but
introduces I could not get past it. As much as
gotcha.
I want to like see the Luke Lando stuff, and I want to like push my Luke Lando ship agenda on that,
Mhm.
and try and interpret it that way. Um, yeah, I just couldn't get into it. But that the prologue, like, or the first chapter, I can't remember if I think it's the prologue, is the introduction to Rey's parents.
Yeah.
And there's like a line in there about it's Rey's father, Dathan. My God, just a terrible name. Dathan talking about Miramir. Just why would you name them the most obnoxious names ever?
Because
Anyways,
somebody
that's
said Dathomir, and they said, "Sorry, that's in use. What if we break it up?" I'm
yeah.
convinced.
You think that's what it is?
I'm convinced.
So there's a line in it about where Miramir gets her piloting skill from, because you can't just be good at something.
Yes.
It has to genetically be passed to you, even though that's not how skills work.
Yes,
Uh,
I recall this
yeah.
bit of
About that her grandmother was an exceptional pilot, and I'm like, let's look at these, let's look at these timelines, right?
Yeah.
And I think I think that potentially one of two things, like they could course correct the whole thing. They could retcon and
Yeah.
course correct the whole thing. I which like wouldn't be the first time in Star Wars.
Mhm.
And say that like her father was, or her grandfather, so Rey's great grandfather was Obi-Wan's brother,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And I think they could combine that with the idea that if her great grandmother wasn't at least force sensitive, that she was a Jedi that survived the purge.
Yep.
And like, because like there's an implication there, there's a very strong
Yep.
implication that
Yep.
there's
I
something going
I
on
would
there.
not be shocked if they, because obviously they plan things, so
Hmm.
far in advance or whatever, but that doesn't mean they can't make small little course corrections. And
Yeah.
what they included in the visual dictionary and with like this little tidbit and things like in the novel, they are throwing, you know, loose threads to where if
Hmm.
they wanted to pull on them for whatever reason, they're there. Just saying, Lucasfilm,
Yeah.
you've got that thread
It
there. You can pull
and
it.
it doesn't have to it doesn't have to undo anything, right? Like it doesn't have to I'm like I think there's also room for them to say that Palpatine was lying,
Yeah.
right? Or that Palpatine was misinformed and that Dathan is in fact not his son.
Yep.
Or clone, right? Because
Yep.
that's what we're kind of led to believe. Um I don't know because I haven't read the rest of the novel, so maybe the rest of the novel like cements it. But who cares?
The
Novels don't matter.
the
Uh,
idea the idea that brings me comfort at night
yeah,
is that Sheev's a liar, and we all know it.
yeah,
Her dad is just anybody. If her mom could be just anybody, but if we have to go the route somewhere, yeah, Kenobi's parents, for whatever reason,
yeah,
decided not to give up this particular child, or maybe he was force sensitive, he just didn't really show it, kind of
yeah.
like how Leia is force sensitive, but she didn't really show it early on,
It's just like latent. Yeah,
outwardly.
yeah,
um and force works in mysterious ways,
yeah.
it skips a generation, whatever, you know and then if
Yeah,
somebody says legacy character, we don't need a legacy character, then they can throw the shoe that says, well, technically his brother isn't a legacy character and he never knew his brother, and
yeah, yeah.
so
This is a new part of the story, right?
yes, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. For me, if it's gonna be about bloodlines, right? Like if that's what it's ultimately gonna be, then the full circle, um, like Obi-Wan's failure with Anakin, even though like the Obi-Wan Kenobi show kind of addresses that already, but like
hmm
but really like we still, yeah, as much as Anakin takes credit for his own fall to the dark side, there is still a component of Obi-Wan's uh hand in that, right? But
sure,
that like Obi-Wan not being able to bring Anakin back and failing in that sense and turning his back, and you know what Vader says of like Obi-Wan once thought as you did, and Luke ultimately having to finish that job.
right,
That to me a Kenobi not being able to save a Skywalker, but then a Kenobi eventually being the one that not only saves a Skywalker, but that because I mean like I want what Marie Claire wants, right? Which is the sheep redemption, right? Like so
mm,
bring them back one more time. I don't care.
yeah,
You can't. I mean, like this is the thing. The Last Jedi, it's all in there, and it comes from an unlikely source in Rose. It's like that's not how we win, right? Like we can't win
right,
by destroying what we hate, and that's what happens. Like they obliterate Palpatine at the end, and it's like, but the dark side is still there, right?
right,
And
you
I think of Bane in the Clone Wars, and he's like, I'll always come back, right? Like
right,
you can never destroy me because you can't destroy the darkness, right? You can like, and I'll cling on to this, and oh, what is it the Inquisitor says in Obi-Wan? He's like, revenge can be a strong motivator or whatever he says,
yeah, yeah,
where it's like, and that's what it is, right? So like
mhm.
I would love to see a sexy Sheev, like a young sexy Sheev, in something like come back like as a clone, like the Dark Empire sort of way.
Well, supposedly we almost had that, so
I know. Oh man, what a mistake. What a mistake.
but,
I
talking about Obi-Wan in the Rose quote,
yeah.
now that I'm thinking about it, Reva Reva
Hmm.
choosing not to kill Luke,
Yeah.
out of her love of her friends at the Jedi temple. She was
Hmm.
saving what she loved
Yeah.
in that moment, you know? So,
Man,
and there you go,
Obi-Wan Kenobi was so good. It was so
yeah,
good. There's
and
so much
living
in there.
redemption through her,
Yeah.
we're asking for it, we're asking to see it. This was a
Yeah.
good start. So
Yeah, I man, like, yeah, did you see? We're gonna wrap up in 2 seconds. We're gonna wrap up in 2 seconds. Did you see the tweet of oh man, his name just fell out of my head. Cal Kestis, who's the actor that plays Cal Kestis?
I know who you're
Uh,
talking about, but I don't remember his name.
yeah, Cameron Monaghan.
Yeah, there you
Uh,
go.
And somebody asked him if if he would like to play Cal Kestis in live action, and if there's anything in the works, and he was just like, yeah, of course I'm open to it. That's all I'm gonna say. That's all I can say. And it was just like, if they're not working on something with Riva and Cal and Marin, of like, you get
Yay.
an Inquisitor, a Night Sister, and a Jedi, and like you put those three together, and then like somehow whatever they did in their timeline is going to affect the Ahsoka story, or like because Ahsoka, Ezra, they're out there, and
Yep.
then just bring it all together 30 years later after that, like go like make that jump 20 to, well actually it's 30 to and then then we get into the sequel era, and
Yep.
bring it all together with Rey. I want Rey to discover that these people, the reason why Ahsoka is not in the sequel trilogy isn't because she's dead. It's because Ahsoka, Ezra, Cal Kestis, like Marin, they all, Riva, they all ended up like in the unknown region somewhere, and there is already another Jedi temple that learned from the mistakes of the previous one, and it's just like, it's every Jedi that ever like fell off the path, which like then still makes Luke being the last Jedi, Rey being the last Jedi, like that still canonically is accurate. They are the last of the Jedi because they're the last of like that old order, right? Like as that continues, but then to then find them and to find out that like there's this other order and they're not Jedi, there's
The
something
middle path.
else, right? Yeah, and to discover that like that they've been like almost like flourishing, and that she doesn't have to start from scratch, right? That she can bring
awesome.
everything that she's got and her whole journey to them, together with them, and for us to have new stories to tell in Star Wars that involve the new Jedi and all of that, and Finn, of course, obviously we got to include in that. And I mean, like that would be a really great way, even like the Lego Star Wars summer vacation thing, with him being like, that's his job. He's going to go out there and try and find more Force sensitives, for him to go out and discover like, oh, you're all out here, and get those that kid from Star Wars Resistance, the little girl that was very clearly Force sensitive, and that they were developing a
I
story
can't
with
remember
that
her
didn't
name,
go
but
anywhere. Yeah. And Broom Boy, right? Like, just like, let's just bring it all together. There's still hope. I think like that's the thing, and that's a really great note to end on, is that like,
I mean,
there's still
they
hope.
have the possibilities. They have the open endings to where they could do a lot with it. They just have to have the want.
Yeah. Most importantly, we just got to tell a good story, right? It's got, and it has to have a reason. It has to have a reason.
One of hope, actual hope, and preferably with a happy ending.
Yeah.
Because that's what we need in this day and age, is something to go right and be happy about it.
Yeah. Amazingly, The Last Jedi ends like everybody dies, and then the Kylo Ren doubles down on the dark side and all of that stuff. And Rose is unconscious, and we don't know if she's going to live at that point. And
but it
Luke
still
dies.
feels hopeful.
But for somehow that final shot in The Last Jedi is one of the most hopeful. I mean, like just the one on the Millennium Falcon, and then the sort of the little epilogue with Broom Boy. It's like, oh, okay, everything's all right.
Yeah.
And we have everything we need. It's all that whole thing. Cool. Well, we did it. I think we did it. I think that's a podcast.
Sweet.
I thank you so much.
Yeah,
for sharing all of that. It was really cool. Putting in all that work, all that effort. You can tell that you're a writer, because that's how you approached it. Was by writing us a story. And that's fantastic. I love it. If let's say people wanted to like check out some of your fan fiction work, where would they go to do that?
Sure. It would be Archive of Our Own. And my author name is Danie, Danie, Marie, Marie. And I have I think it's like 5 Star Wars stories ranging from just general audiences, you know, up to mature adults. And then I have, uh, I also am into Elder Scrolls. So I have 2 Elder Scrolls stories as well. So, but yep,
Cool.
any age range, and it's both canon verse and alternate universe, modern day. I got it.
Nice. Awesome. And throw your Twitter handle out there as well, so people can
Yes,
follow you on Twitter.
if you want to follow me on Twitter as well, or just see the nonsense I type every day, you can find me at 87 Zoo Lemons. I'm a YouTube fan, and that's why it's weird.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the first episode. Thank you
Yeah,
to
thank you
everybody
for having me.
for listening, for tuning in.
Yes.
And we'll be back in 4 weeks time. I haven't lined up my next guest. I mean, like, I have a few people that I'm talking to. I haven't scheduled anything for the next one, so I don't know who the next guest is, but but hopefully this was fun and everybody enjoyed it. And you'll tune in for the next episode. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to support us on Patreon, get the episode early, you can do that at patreon.com/thunderquack. And I haven't done all the social media stuff, so I actually don't even know what all of the social media handles are. But you know what I'll do is, between now and the time that I edit this podcast to post it, I will have done that, and it'll be in the rigmarole at the end, because there will be a whole thing. We're recording this well in advance of release, which I like for a change. It gives me some time.
I tried.
Yeah. But again, thank you, Danielle, for hanging out and talking about Star Wars.
Yeah, anytime.
And yeah, we'll see you guys on the next episode. Thank you for listening to Thunderquack Force Perspectives. Our opening theme is composed for us by Christy Carew. Follow Force Perspectives on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at ForcePOV. And join us on Discord at thunderquack.com/Discord. Support the show by visiting us at patreon.com/thunderquack to get early access to episodes, leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast service, or buy merch at store.thunderquack.com. Force Perspectives is a part of the Thunderquack Podcast Network.